Our special guest today is Rob Maisel. That's Maisel, coming to us today from New York. Rob recently retired from Bloomberg Media, where he was involved in global mobility and cross-cultural training. And he also recently came back from a trip around the world, taking a lot of pictures, testing his own outlook on multiculturalism and learning about cultures and learning languages. He loves to travel and loves the idea of cross-cultural communications, and photography is one of his favorite things to do. He's writing a new book about self-achievement. Let's welcome Rob Maisel.
Okay, so we're going to talk about cross-cultural training, and we're going to start off, though, about your background. And I'd like to bring in the idea of the coronavirus impacting you in New York, epicenter. Not much of that going on here, certainly there's some, and just the whole idea. So your background is as a world traveler. Most recently, as I read, you were with Bloomberg.
Correct.
And you're in a special unit. So tell us a little bit about yourself, if you could take a minute, and then we can go further beyond. So what did you do at Bloomberg, and what was the highlight of that career?
Sure. So I was working with Bloomberg, looking at their relocations from a bird's eye perspective, all the elements of the relocation, looking for ways we could improve processes. And oh man, so many highlights. Just worked with a great group of people. I think really just coming out of it with a strong sense of corporate mobility, specifically on the client side.
Yeah, and did you do much traveling?
No, funny enough, I think sometimes people think they hear global mobility, and it's funny because while we do definitely deal with mobility of employees, oftentimes, not always, the people in this role are stationary, and my role was relatively stationary there at the Bloomberg headquarters in New York.
Yeah, okay. And so what kind of volume were you involved with overseeing or managing?
Sure. So, we're really looking at in peak months, anywhere from around 70 to 80 relocations going on per month, which is quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So how much of that was inbound to the U.S.?
That's a great question. With Bloomberg, there was a lot of movement between the two headquarters, so New York and London. So would say inbound to the US, a solid portion. If I had to put a statistic on it, probably at least 35, 40%.
And so were these reporters or salespeople?
There were some people in the news field. It was a mix, but there was a lot of engineering folks being moved as well.
Interesting. Okay, so Bloomberg is global, a lot going on. There's a lot of coverage coming out of Singapore and Hong Kong. Were you involved in that?
No, I must say that I did get the opportunity to meet Charlie Pellet, who is the guy who says, "Stand clear of the closing doors, please," on the New York City Metro. And so on my one of my first days, we did get a tour of the building, and subsequently, I did get to see what some of the broadcasting that was going on in the building, and the facilities that they use and the equipment. I was quite impressed, but my actual role didn't really have much to do with the actual Bloomberg radio or TV. It was more focused on the movement of the people.
Yeah, I get you. Okay, so what is your goal right now? What do you want to do next?
So really, my biggest goal right now is, I've got these passions of languages, cultures, and travel. And really, it's a matter of getting it out to the world, getting that message out to the world, and I think letting the next steps find me.
Okay, and so, the virus has really impacted everything. So, what do you think your crystal ball for the rest of this year, just like between now and New Year's? Will relocations pick up? Or will it just be short-term business travel in and out, in and out?
Yeah, you know, Ed, that's a great question. I think right now, there, as you mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty with the virus. Companies are really not sure a couple months down the line where everything's going to be. And I think that is definitely impacting their decisions. So I think we're seeing a lot of hesitation with corporations not wanting to commit to long-term things, long-term, moves or permanent moves right now due to the uncertainty of the situation. So as you mentioned, I think right now there's nothing, and there's all kinds of visa restrictions and travel bans. But as the virus starts to weaken, or the effects of the virus, I think what we're going to start seeing is slowly but surely an increase in the business travels, and then sort of assessing from there whether relocations are going to make sense. And then this could change the whole landscape, really, what's going on right now.
Yeah, I was broadcasting earlier today with Sandrine Bardot from Paris, has been living in Dubai the past several years. And she's an international comp and ben specialist. And also on that same call was a gentleman in Mannheim, Germany, Suman Chowdhury, very experienced in global HR and global mobility, from New York and London, India, where he's from, as well as currently in Germany. And so we were discussing, or actually they were discussing, I was listening, about the impact of the virus, and they all agreed, everybody agreed that mobility isn't going away, it's just going to dramatically change. And the idea of this kind of a discussion on Zoom or other video resources, sure to come, will make this a lot easier, and maybe once a year have an in-person visit. But the transactional business and being in touch and doing things, we're just going to have to learn new tricks, I guess, and just be more responsible individually, and press the flesh in person when we can and when it's safer.
Ed, I think that's a great point. And, companies are really looking at this, I think, hopefully progressive companies are looking at this time as an opportunity, and seeing the need to change and thinking about how to change. And I recently actually wrote a few articles about the mobility landscape and the thinking that needs to shift, because we have a situation where traditionally people are going from point A to point B, New York to London, right? So for right now, we know that that's not happening. So companies have to get into the mindset of bringing point A is their home office, but point B is their home, right? So transitioning, the mobility shift right now is actually bringing people from their offices to their homes. And to your point, it's also really showing everybody in this industry the importance of virtual teams. Because I mean, how many Zoom calls have you been on in the past couple of weeks? I think everybody's gotten really comfortable with Zoom, and I think people are learning that, especially right now when they can't physically be relocating or going on business trips, there's still a lot of interaction that can and needs to happen between teams, and it's happening virtually.
So, being a specialist in culture, how can you do culture better through a Zoom?
That's a great question, Ed. A lot of times cultural understanding can help. So for example, if you have a global team and you have lots of folks from different countries on there, understanding some of the hierarchical boundaries that certain cultures may have, understanding whether they're sort of high context, low context. Low context cultures tend to be more direct. High context cultures tend to be a little bit more indirect. Understanding some of these things can help really sort of change the way that communication happens in a virtual way.
So other tips that you can give our audience about how to get better at understanding what not to do. So for instance, you and I are Americans. I'm in southernmost Southern California, and you're in Manhattan. So culturally, we're pretty okay. But then how would you deal with somebody from Pakistan or India, for instance?
Right.
You know, surely in Silicon Valley and in Manhattan, there's tons of Indian techies running around and billionaires as well. But there's a whole lot of other people also
Right.
that we're going to run into. And they don't particularly like to look you in the eye. They're less direct, right?
Yes.
How do you get your point across, and how do you get them to feel comfortable with you when they don't really want to look at you in the eye?
So Ed, that's a great question, and that's a question that I think really needs to be answered. So for everyone watching, and for you as well, if you're not aware, I actually recently put out a video about some of my cross-cultural experience that I had living and working in Japan. And Japan is a phenomenal example to answer this question, because in Japanese culture, you experience that. Japanese folks tend to be less direct. They tend to look away, I'd say anywhere from 70 to 80% of the time, and only make direct eye contact about 20 to 30, whereas you'd say in the US, it's probably flopped, right? We're probably looking at the other person in the eyes at least 60 or 70% of the time. And so how do we deal with that, right? What do we do? The best thing really is to understand the differences, is to understand, sort of look at it objectively. So understanding that this person maybe not looking at you, but not coming to the conclusion, not rushing to the conclusion that they are not paying attention because they are not looking at you. So understanding that, in fact, they are, but in their culture, it's rude to look you in the eyes for too long or too directly, and they're worried about making you uncomfortable. So understanding that and sort of tailoring to their needs, and so not completely abandoning your culture, but coming somewhere in the middle to foster an understanding. So maybe understanding that you looking them in the eyes 70% of the time is a little too much. So maybe toning it down to somewhere between 40 and 60, let's call it 50%, to meet in the middle.
Yeah. Okay, so how would you characterize, in general, having a meeting by Zoom with somebody in Rio de Janeiro?
Are you
culture aspects are there? Elements?
Sure. That's a great question. And this is a good one for me to talk about too, because I have extensive experience in Brazil. I've been down a bunch of times. I've spent a ton of time there. Eu falo português também, which I just told you, I also speak Portuguese. So the kind of interactions are going to be interesting that you might experience in a Zoom call with let's say an American person and a Brazilian. Brazilians tend to be very animated and excited to talk. They might even cut you off a little bit, not intending to be rude, because they're excited to say what they want to say. It's a culture that tends to be more fluid with time, and so they're probably not going to be too concerned if their call goes over the allotted amount of time. So my advice would be to an American, for example, if you have a strict time limit to the call, you probably are going to want to say something, maybe in the beginning, just to set expectations and say, hey, listen, we're set for 30 minutes. I just want to let you know that I actually only have 30 minutes here. And just to be clear, because otherwise they might go on, and also not to take offense if they seem to get distracted by something. Relationships are very important in Brazil. So if someone, especially now, stops to have a small conversation with their wife, they're not being rude in terms of how they would perceive that. Whereas an American might think, hey, hold on, we've allotted this time to strictly talk you and I, but that's the relationship coming in, the relationship component, where in the US, it's more of a task-based component. My task is to talk to you, and here, so you see where we're going with that.
So what else should we talk about today?
Let's talk a little bit about languages. I think those are fascinating. I have taken it upon myself to, I've traveled to 50 countries on several extended trips around, so the US, South America, Asia, Europe, and then most recently a world trip. And I have this burning desire, this passion to communicate with people. And what's really helped me foster that sense of communication and understanding with folks all over the world is my ability to speak languages. And it was really, that was the impetus for me learning 4 additional languages, Ed.
Je parle français un très peu.
Ah, très bien, très bien. Actually, French is not one of my languages.
That's it, the end of it for me. but I really appreciate your skill, though. So
Thanks, Ed.
let's talk about Italy for a moment.
Okay.
All right. Say Positano, Amalfi Coast.
Okay.
Is the language there different from Milano?
So that's a great question. I'll say that I'm not too familiar with regional differences within Italy, but I would suspect that they probably are, because most times in a language, whether it's in the States, north from south, there's quite a difference. Oftentimes due to, it could be, historical factors, geographical factors, and others. Language does, it's fascinating because language does tend to evolve differently, even within the same country. Based upon where people are and the needs of the communication.
Yeah, and whether it's industrial or agricultural, I would guess.
Right, right.
So with that in mind, because you mentioned Portugal, and we happen to love Portugal, so the difference between, say, Porto and Lisboa, big difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when we were tourists, not working, but we had just come from a trip. We were in Paris, and then we, on business, produced one of my meetings, then went over to Zurich, and we met up with some friends, and I also produced a business meeting in Zurich, and then we went to Porto, and we were going to go to a business meeting, but by that time I was meetinged out, and we decided to play hooky. And
excellent.
And it was beautiful weather, and it was in May, so it was a little bit pre-season, so it was not crowded at all. And geez, what a wonderful experience that was in Porto. And then we took the train south into Lisbon, stayed at the Four Seasons, along that main drag there, and then walked down to the harbor and did all that. And that's very, very different than Porto.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Ed, have you been to Brazil?
Brazil many times. And in 2008, I produced my first meeting in Sao Paulo, and it was held at the Hyatt Regency near that bridge, whatever that bridge is called, fancy bridge. Well, I partnered with PricewaterhouseCoopers in that time, and they invited their clients. So it was a sellout. It was a big event. And then about a year and a half later, I produced a meeting in Rio, very different. And our partner there was, we had 2 partners, Coca-Cola and Ernst & Young.
Okay.
I think you may know that in the Coke building across from Sugarloaf, it's a tall building that says Coca-Cola on the top of it.
Right.
Ernst & Young has the top floor there. And so our meeting was held in the Ernst & Young offices overlooking Sugarloaf. Yeah, and then we also produced another meeting south of there. I forget what it's called. It's about 20 miles south along the beach, new area. I want to say Macarena, but I think that's the song. Somewhere around there. So we did a meeting there because that was all oil and gas.
Okay. Yeah, and it's a really fascinating thing because as you were talking about regional differences within countries, I've noticed from spending time in Brazil that, for example, I would say I'm trained in the Rio dialect, so I speak more like a carioca is what they call people from Rio de Janeiro, and they tend to say, for example, the word door, porta, and those in Sao Paulo would say porta. So they pronounce the R, whereas it kind of turns into an H with people from Rio de Janeiro. So little differences like that. And I remember when I was in Portugal back years ago on one of these long trips that I took a train trip around Europe for a couple months. It was 2 months. And I said, let me test my Portuguese. Let me see if I could do a little bit. I know it's going to be really different. And the dialect was very different. It didn't feel as animated with the gestures or the up and downs of the Brazilian Portuguese. But I noticed even differences in the speech, like estação de comboio, like for train station, and estação de trem in Brazil. So little even words were different, and it's just fascinating what happens with these differences within speaking the same language.
It's interesting talking with you about this. Okay, what other stories can you talk about?
Sure. I think one more interesting thing that we should note is just on the topic of languages is what you did just right in the beginning, Ed. And I don't even know if you realized what you were doing, but you spit out a little French, right? And let's say an American is going to France and they just do what you did, that you are already light years ahead of what most people would ever do. And I think when people do that, it's incredible. And I'll explain what I'm talking about. Showing a culture and a country that you understand even one word, a few words, a key phrase or two in their native tongue is astounding to some folks, and it garners such respect, and you can, I mean, the more you speak the better, but you can really unlock these incredible doors of communication just by showing them that you're not going to talk in English, and actually, hey, you understand a phrase here and there. People love that.
Oh, thank you for saying that. That's great.
Yeah. So just to build on that, I have a story of this. When I traveled around China, I did about 3 months there. I didn't speak any Chinese, but in that time, I was able to become fluent. Sorry, fluent is not the word. I was able to become basic conversational in Mandarin. And how? Because I was just talking to people, and that's how I've learned the majority of my languages, actually, is just by interacting with people at the place. And I noticed these fascinating things that just by saying, ni hao, and it was like, oh, okay, wow, this guy knows. And pointing to a menu, simple things like jiga he, wo yao jiga he jiga. All I'm saying is I want this and that, and I'm pointing to the menu, but they have so much more respect for that than somebody who is clearly disinterested in learning anything about them and just wants to order their food.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Okay, so what are you going to be doing the rest of the year?
It's a great question. So for the rest of the year, a lot of interesting things going on. So I'm focusing on producing, based on my passions. So travel, cultures, languages. I'm focusing on producing interesting content on my website, which is just my name, www.robmaisel.com. And also on LinkedIn. I want to be a resource for people and share my knowledge and my passions. And that's going to come in the form of articles, videos, blog posts. And most recently, I have taken on the task of writing a book. I've decided I'm writing a book.
Well, you're a glutton for punishment.
Indeed.
So That's a lot of work. I mean, mentally, sure, you're a gymnast, but um, getting it down on paper and in a regular pattern and sticking to it, that's brutal.
Ed, you're right. And you know what I've seen, when this, um, I think I'm really seeing a shift right now in myself. I'm looking at it like life 2.0 right now. And what I noticed was, I watched this, um, it was a podcast from a friend of mine named Jared Yellen, who talked about, in times of crisis like now, stepping into legendary. And that really resonated with me. And I said to myself, you know what, I could sit here and be nervous and be scared about the future, but that's uncontrollable, right? Why don't I focus on what I can control? And what I can control is doing the things that I love and sharing that with the world. And so I said to myself, I'm going to dedicate myself to doing that. And to your point, it's absolutely challenging. It takes hard work, dedication, resilience, and it takes accountability. Um, but I think with the right frame of mind, the right specific goals that people have, and having sort of a path to get to those goals in specific, um, you know, whatever it might be, routines that they do on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, if we're able to build those into our calendar, it's extremely effective in holding us accountable toward reaching those goals.
Talking with Rob Maisel, Maisel.
Correct?
So is it robertmaisel.com or Rob Maisel?
It's robmaisel.com.
There you go. Great. Okay, so thanks for being our guest on Global. Really,
My pleasure.
we'll do this again.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for your time, Ed.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.